Welcome to the ITSS Verona member series on defense and procurement, hosted by Romain Gallix and myself, Arnaud Sobrero. Today we're going to discuss the trends and implications of defense spending and procurement in Southeast Asia. In the last 3 years, we have seen some increased efforts in boosting defense spending and in acquiring new capabilities, essentially within air and sea power. While those efforts in modernizing armed forces can be attributed to steady economic growth, one of the key drivers is related to some increased anxiety in terms of regional security. Joining us today to discuss those topics is Richard Bitzinger. It's a real honor to have Richard here, as he is a well-known expert on defense-related issues. Richard is a visiting Richards Fellow with the Military Transformations Program at the Singapore-based think tank RSIS, where his work has focused on security and defense-related issues within the Asia-Pacific region. He was previously a senior fellow at ISIS from 2006 to 2018, and he led the Military Transformations Program from 2012 to 2018. Richard has written several books, and his articles have appeared in journals such as International Security, Orbits, China Quarterly, and Survival. Richard has previously worked at the RAND Corporation, the Center for Strategic and Budgetary Affairs, the Asia-Pacific Center for Security Studies, and the U.S. Central Intelligence Agency. So a warm welcome, Richard, and thank you for being here.
Well, thank you for asking me.
Well, Richard, start us off by walking us through the key trends in military expenditures you're seeing in Southeast Asia. And maybe you can touch upon how the importance of those defense spending is a reflection of a growing security concern.
Yes, well, I mean, certainly trends in military expenditures in Southeast Asia have basically been upward. It's actually been upward for several decades. There are times where countries will have to take a pause here or there, and there has been, downward trends too in individual countries. But overall, what we've seen is a lot of the major players in Southeast Asia, Singapore, Malaysia, Indonesia, Vietnam, Thailand, even the Philippines, have in general been increasing their defense spending. And you don't need to increase it much, a few million, few hundred million here can actually turn into quite a sizable percentage increase. So you see a general upwards trend, and a lot of that is, of course, due to regional security. There has always been a lot of animosity, or certainly suspicions, and to a certain extent enmity within the Southeast Asian nations, particularly their competing claims in the South China Sea when it comes to, islands, territories, exclusive economic zones. But certainly over the last decade or more, China and its increasingly assertive behavior, and particularly in the South China Sea, has probably become a major driver of that. And when we look at the kind of weapons that these countries are buying, that tends to be a reflection of those insecurities about Chinese capabilities and Chinese actions.
Great, thank you, Richard. Well, diving deep more on those capabilities you just mentioned, can you walk us through a bit more the type of capabilities those Southeast Asian nations are focusing on?
Well, as I say, since much of this is driven by Chinese operations, particularly in the South China Sea, what you're seeing is that a lot of the capabilities that these Southeast Asian ASEAN countries are acquiring are basically also in the maritime domain. So we see a lot of cases where countries are buying bigger and more capable types of surface vessels, corvettes and long-range offshore patrol vessels. We see them equipping those with more capable types of weapons, particularly anti-ship cruise missiles, and then also air defense systems to protect them. We also, particularly, for example, see a lot of increase in submarine procurement. So a lot of countries which either didn't have submarines, say 20 years ago, or had extremely old ones, are actually in the process now of acquiring pretty new and pretty significant capabilities in undersea operations. And this, of course, gives them additional capabilities in the maritime domain. On top of that, more drones, mostly for surveillance and reconnaissance. And particularly, again, a lot of them are ship-based, which expands sort of the intelligence horizon of these ships. In the air, we see a lot of countries who are replacing relatively old aircraft with, in some cases, some of the more modern ones. Singapore buying the F-35, Indonesia buying Rafale, for example. And countries that didn't have fast jets, like the Philippines, are starting to get them again. And these, of course, have complementarity with this improvements in the maritime domain. What we don't see so much, which is probably another indicator, is in land forces. Most ground forces are still basically under equipped relative to the other ones. And this is probably not a bad thing because, again, most of the security concerns facing Southeast Asia are from far away and tend to be maritime with an air support adjunct to that. And so therefore what they're buying is systems to directly counter those types of security challenges and threats.
Thank you for your insights. So a third question to go a bit more in depth in terms of policies. So to what extent do security concerns in the South China Sea that you mentioned affect Asian countries' policies, defense policies?
Yeah, well, again, this is something that we've seen a long time coming. Of course, for decades, China and Southeast Asian countries have had a lot of overlapping claims and conflict, particularly in the South China Sea, until probably about 10 or 12 years ago. This was largely, as we would say, backburnered. That is, the countries agreed not to let things get too far out of hand. But then roughly around 2010, we've seen a pretty dramatic increase in Chinese military activities in the South China Sea. And we've seen them in some ways. In the western part of the South China Sea, places like Woody Island and Hainan Island, we've seen a pretty substantial military buildup. In the eastern part of the South China Sea, in the Spratlys, of course, the Chinese went on this huge building spree where they constructed artificial islands out of what were basically reefs that barely stuck up above water, essentially creating new properties, new territories, and then declaring them sovereign. And then in the middle, they've been filling this with, again, increased naval activities by the PLAN, particularly the creation of a new unified Coast Guard, which is very strong and heavily armed. And then, of course, this whole concept of what they used to call the little green men, what some people have called the maritime militia. And these are ostensibly fishing boats that basically purposely go out into the South China Sea and sort of nudge around, test the envelopes, in some cases purposely get into trouble so that the Coast Guard, the Chinese Coast Guard, can come to their rescue, so to speak. And all of these things have basically heightened the tension in the region. And of course, the Chinese have begun to make statements like they have indisputable sovereignty over the South China Sea. They don't claim it as actual territory of China, but they claim that this is essentially theirs to determine security within. And that includes things like foreign military ships transiting through and other kind of things. And I think, ultimately what they're trying to do is turn the South China Sea into a Chinese lake, so to speak. That is Chinese in all but name, de facto, if not de jure. On top of that, of course, the countries in Southeast Asia have their own conflicting and overlapping claims in the region. And so all of this is basically grist for the mill. And it, of course, sucks in other areas north and south of the South China Sea. It increases the strategic importance of an already important strategic strait, which is the Singapore-Malacca Straits. And it is increasing the concerns over what's going on in the Taiwan Strait. And of course, roping in the fact that Taiwan is increasingly under a security threat from China as well. So the whole region within what we call the first island chain is rapidly becoming one of increased Chinese militarization and heightened militarized control by China. And then the question is how much can they solidify their control of these waterways? And then how much can they expand this out further into the Pacific?
Yeah, great insight, Richard. Obviously, the militarization of South China Sea is a concern for America as well, and American allies. And last year, and they have signed the Alcus Pact in September, so between Australia, UK, and the US to provide some nuclear propulsion-related technologies about submarines, which is obviously a great shift in terms of defense policy for Australia. How do you think that pact, because obviously, those future Australian submarines, part of their role would be to patrol potentially the South China Sea to potentially to deter some action from China. So how do you think that AUKUS Pact today will impact Southeast Asian spending or capabilities? And can we talk about an arms race happening right now?
Well, first of all, I think it's a little premature to read too much into the AUKUS Pact. I mean, at this point, it's still being negotiated and the details are being sort of hashed out. What it is currently restricted to or narrowed to is simply the exchange of nuclear propulsion technologies that will allow Britain and the United States to transfer nuclear propulsion technology for submarines to Australia, and Australia then is going to probably construct 8 nuclear-powered submarines. Originally, of course, they were going to produce 12 conventional submarines based on a French design. It's probably too expensive. But the advantage, of course, is that with a nuclear submarine, they can patrol much longer and they can go they can go deeper. And yes, they will be using those submarines throughout the Pacific area. They will probably be going into the South China Sea or at least in adjacent waters to it. And this will eventually have an impact. I think it's going to be a while. The next question, of course, is how much does the pact go beyond this? Does it turn into something more equivalent of a military alliance like NATO or something? Does it bring in other countries? Does it involve other technologies? Hand in hand with submarines, of course, is anti-submarine warfare technologies. And will those also be sort of folded into something like this? This is all speculation very much, but from the standpoint of the West and its security concerns in Asia, these are positive speculations. That is, they're one where they feel like they can build on this. Who knows? This could bring in Japan. It could bring in India or something like that. But what that means then is you do run the risk of creating not just a submarine arms race, but you create a arms race in nuclear-powered submarines. The South Koreans, for example, are already trying to work out a nuclear-powered submarine. They have already built and deployed submarines, conventionally powered, that can launch short-range missiles. And of course, it's only a few steps further before they could actually have a nuclear-powered missile-carrying submarine. Maybe not nuclear-armed, certainly, because that's another dangerous step, but certainly one that expands the capacity for these countries to be able to engage in more extensive submarine kind of operations. And then the question is, how do other nations react to that? It's probably, like I say, very premature to say there's going to be a huge proliferation of nuclear-powered submarines. But, we've already seen a pretty substantial spread of conventional subs.
Thank you. To go a bit further in this on this field, you mentioned South Korea, the US, the UK, France. So what are the regional trends in terms of origin countries of providers of defense material in the region?
Yeah. Well, what I've always said, one of the interesting things about Southeast Asia is that from the perspective of an arms market, it's a very relatively open market. Some countries like Japan only buy from the United States. Some countries like India pretty much only buy from Russia. But in Southeast Asia, it's very open, and it's possible for a lot of countries, a lot of potential arms suppliers, to be able to play a role. And we've seen this. For example, France being able to sell aircraft to Indonesia. Sweden has sold the Gripen to Thailand. The United States, of course, and Russia have pretty sizable market shares, particularly in aircraft. Submarines, the Swedes, the Germans, the Russians, and Chinese have all had pieces of the market there. Missiles even more so. And so what you see is a pretty competitive market. And a lot of countries see Southeast Asia as a small but very lucrative niche. And they all want to play. And the fact of the matter is that these countries in Southeast Asia are very welcoming of a variety of different players. And it does help them get pretty good deals. And the other part of it, of course, is a lot of these countries have their own arms industries. And they're trying very hard to acquire technology to at least act ultimately as an import substitution strategy, as be able to build their own weapons instead of importing, and then maybe, just maybe, becoming exporters. They're not really much yet, but it's not impossible. And one of the best examples is if you look at the Korean defense industry. And, this took decades to sort of reach a point that they're in today, where they're actually becoming a pretty significant supplier in certain types of weapons, for example, self-propelled howitzers, where they've done very well. So these are obviously the long-term goals. I would say in the 20-odd years that I've been looking at Southeast Asian arms procurement and arms imports and arms production, that the expectations always run far ahead of reality. But that doesn't mean that they don't get something out of it. That is, the half a loaf type of result. So it's, getting back to the original point, it's a very open and competitive market, and one where suppliers are really willing to deal and supply technologies and supply local production and all sorts of other types of incentives. And that benefits these countries in the region.
Great, Richard. One final question will be some perspective 5 to 10 years ahead. How do you see those trends moving forward? You mentioned there's obviously an increase in acquisition of capabilities, submarines, surface ships, air capabilities. And it's a very Pact region in some areas. So how do you see that accumulation of hardware and increased defense spending is going to impact on the mid to long term?
Yeah. Well, let's particularly look out 10 years, because I think that's where, because it takes so long for a lot of procurement programs to actually reach fruition. So if we came back here and say 2030, 2032, and looked at the same thing, I think the first thing we'd find is navies have gotten a lot bigger and a lot heavier. That is replacing patrol boats with larger types of multi-role ships. We might see some more submarines, although I think that that could slow down. It really depends on, like, say, Indonesia, if they start really buying a lot. I think what's important, too, is we'll probably see an increase in surveillance capabilities. So, ISR is something that has really been negligent in most Southeast Asian militaries. And I think you'll find a lot of them increasing their use of things like drones, UAVs for ISR, maybe even surface, unmanned systems, more sophisticated types of sensors like radar and infrared systems. An increase in maritime patrol aircraft was something that a lot of these countries need, and I think we'll get. And then probably in the area of air forces, I think you'll see some countries, particularly Sweden will get, not Sweden, sorry, Singapore will get the F-35. Certainly the other countries will probably get things like the Rafale. Some might buy more Gripen, or might get, Sukhois. I think you're going to see that as an increase. And so, the basic trends are upward for depending on how you feel about that. I think you'll see more spending, or certainly you'll see constant spending. You'll see the commitment to military modernization proceeding apace, not retreating, and that's going to reflect itself in continued procurement of highly advanced systems going in this area. Not a lot in terms of numbers, maybe, but certainly a lot in terms of capabilities. And as I've always said, the new stuff is going to provide new capabilities that the old weapons didn't have. So things like improved standoff strike, either air to ground or air to air. Improvements in intelligence and surveillance, that is just battle space knowledge. So you're going to find all of these militaries, to varying degrees, are just going to become better at doing their job.
Great. Well, thank you for those great insights, Richard. And it was a pleasure to have you here today.
Well, I appreciate the opportunity. Thank you.